For 10 years, the road had been my home. Not in the romantic sense you might imagine. No wind in your hair freedom or postcard sunsets. It was a grind, mile after mile, hauling whatever companies paid me to transport. 3 years ago, I worked for a logistics outfit out of Kansas. February 2nd of that year, a Monday, was particularly bitter. The kind of cold that gnawed at your bones and made your breath hang in the air like ghostly whispers. I remember that day vividly. The week had barely begun, and the dispatcher had piled on deliveries like we were racing the apocalypse. My rig, an 18-wheeler that had seen better days, was loaded to capacity, and I was determined to make the trip without losing time. I hit the road at 3 p.m. sharp, my sights set on reaching the drop-off point before the night was over. Stopping for rest wasn't in the cards. By the time midnight rolled around, I was running on fumes. My eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead, and my head bobbed involuntarily as I fought to stay alert. I was cruising just over the speed limit, not reckless, but enough to shave a few minutes off the clock. The highway stretched ahead like an endless ribbon of asphalt, lit only by the pale glow of my headlights. It was just me in the night, or so I thought. Reaching for the water bottle wedged into the cup holder, I noticed something in the distance, a shadow in the road. I blinked hard, thinking it might be a trick of my overtired mind, but as the shape grew larger, it resolved into a figure, a man. My foot slammed the brake instinctively, and the truck groaned as it fought against inertia. The hiss of the air brakes sounded like a wild animal's warning cry. As the rig slowed to a halt, I got a better look at him. He stood almost dead center in the lane, dressed head to toe in black. A scarf, or maybe a piece of fabric, draped loosely around his neck, fluttering in the wind. There was something wrong about his posture, though. His neck seemed too long, stretched unnaturally like a distorted image in a funhouse mirror. I squinted, trying to make out his face, but it was wrong, indistinct, a smudge where features should have been. The thought crossed my mind to roll down the window and ask if he needed help. But before I could reach for the crank, the man moved. Not toward me as I half expected, but sideways, into the woods that bordered the highway. He didn't run, didn't stumble. He simply glided, soundless and deliberate, until the shadows swallowed him whole. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the engine idling, and my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My chest heaved with shallow breaths, my heart racing like I'd just escaped some unseen predator. Then, against every ounce of instinct screaming at me to turn the truck around and head back, I pressed on. 5 minutes passed. 10. The fear began to ebb, replaced by rationalizations. Just a drifter. Maybe a drunk wandering too close to the road. Nothing supernatural about it, right? But then it happened again. Something darted across the highway, just beyond the reach of my headlights. My first thought was a deer or maybe a coyote, but as I approached, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was another figure. This one moved faster, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it crossed from one side of the road to the other. I couldn't make out details, just a blur of black against the gray backdrop of asphalt. My pulse quickened. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, as though speed alone could outrun the dread coiling in my gut. The miles crawled by. The monotony of the road should have been a comfort, but it only heightened my awareness of every sound, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. The cab felt suffocating, the walls of the sleeper compartment pressing in like a tomb. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I spotted a gravel pull-off and guided the truck onto it, the tires crunching loudly in the stillness. The parking area was small, barely large enough for my rig, but it would do. I killed the engine and leaned back in my seat, exhaustion overtaking me. My eyes closed almost immediately. It wasn't the cold that woke me, nor the stiffness in my neck from sleeping at an awkward angle. It was the tapping. At first it was faint, a gentle rhythmic sound, like knuckles brushing against the windshield. I opened my eyes groggily, disoriented, my mind still clinging to the fog of sleep. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw him. The man in black was standing directly in front of the truck, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the parking lights. Except now his face wasn't a smudge. It was worse. His features were grotesquely exaggerated, as though someone had taken a normal human face and stretched it to the breaking point. His grin was impossibly wide, his teeth gleaming in the dim light like a predator's. His eyes, bulging, bloodshot, locked onto mine with an intensity that froze the breath in my lungs. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so profound it pressed against my ears. Slowly the man raised a hand and placed it flat against the glass. His fingers splayed like the legs of a spider. Something snapped inside me. Without thinking, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, but the man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I would hit him. But then he was gone. The rest of the drive to my destination was a blur. When I finally parked at the warehouse and shut off the engine, the weight of the night crashed down on me. The next morning, under the stark light of day, the memories felt distant, almost dreamlike. But the terror was real. And to this day, every time I drive that route, I keep my eyes peeled for shadows that don't belong. It happened 15 years ago when I was only 8 years old. My father was a trucker, and as you might guess, he spent most of his time on the road. School vacations were the rare times when I could join him on his routes, and I cherished those trips. The open road felt like an adventure, with its endless stretches of asphalt, truck-stop diners serving pancakes and burgers, and nights under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. That summer in 2005 began like any other. A week had passed since the school year ended, and my father told me to pack for a longer haul than usual. I didn't mind. Longer trips meant more time with him and more adventures to fill my memory. Early the next morning, we set off. The first few hours passed in the usual way. I immersed myself in my Game Boy, occasionally glancing out the window at fields that stretched endlessly and clusters of trees that rushed past like dark green blurs. Somewhere around mid-morning, we pulled into a McDonald's for breakfast. I remember the smell of sizzling hash browns and the sticky sweetness of maple syrup. We ate quickly and got back on the road. The truck roared to life, and we began our journey again, heading deeper into the heart of nowhere. About an hour after we resumed, a strange noise interrupted the hum of the tires against the road. A loud scraping sound came from the truck's right side. My father frowned, muttering something under his breath as he pulled over onto the shoulder. "Stay here," he said before hopping out to investigate. I stayed inside, clutching my Game Boy, but no longer interested in the game. Through the windshield, I watched as my dad crouched near the rear of the truck, examining something I couldn't see. His phone pressed to his ear told me he was explaining the problem to someone. Though I couldn't make out the words, his tense tone was enough to tell me things weren't good. We limped along to a nearby repair shop. By the time we were back on the road, several hours had passed, and the sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. I returned to my game, trying to make the most of the dwindling daylight. Night came quickly, and as the road turned dark, so did my eyelids. I leaned against the door and drifted off to the rhythmic vibration of the truck. I woke with a jolt, the truck suddenly lurching forward. My father was driving fast, his grip on the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. A heavy tension filled the cab, and though he said nothing at first, his silence felt louder than any explanation. "Don't be scared," he finally said, his voice flat and without reassurance. I wasn't scared, yet, but his demeanor unsettled me. My father was a man of few words, but this was different. He was focused on the road ahead as though something unseen was chasing us. I turned my head to look outside. At first I saw only darkness, the kind that swallows everything beyond the reach of headlights. Then I caught a glimpse of something. It was white and moving unnaturally fast, faster than any person or animal should. The figure darted in and out of view, moving alongside the truck before veering away. It returned moments later, this time slamming into the driver's side window with a force that made the glass shudder but didn't break it. My father flinched but kept driving. The thing, a figure, began to take shape. It wasn't running, as I initially thought. No, it was floating, hovering, just inches off the ground. Its hair was long and black, obscuring its face, and it wore a tattered white dress that whipped violently in the wind as if caught in an invisible storm. I stared, unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at me to do so. Each time the figure vanished into the darkness, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But it always came back, closer, bolder. At one point, it pressed itself against my father's window, its face nearly visible beneath the curtain of hair. "Close your eyes," my father said, his voice trembling. I obeyed, shutting my eyes tightly, but the sound of his heavy breathing, punctuated by whispered prayers and the occasional curse, painted a vivid picture of his terror. Then came the scream. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, a mixture of rage and agony that pierced through the truck's walls and made my blood run cold. The figure pounded on the window, its fists creating a rhythm of dread. I don't know how long it lasted. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. Eventually, I felt the truck slow, and when I opened my eyes, I saw the lights of a small town up ahead. Civilization. The figure was gone. We pulled into a gas station, but neither of us got out. My father sat silently, his hands still gripping the wheel, his eyes fixed on the neon sign above the pumps. We never spoke of that night again. Whatever we saw, it stayed with him until the day he died 6 years later. It wasn't until recently that I learned the most chilling part of the story. My mother told me that during the encounter, the figure spoke to my father. It didn't scream or wail like before. It spoke in a calm, familiar voice. It used my grandmother's voice, his mother's voice. She had been dead for years, but when the figure leaned closer to the window and lifted its face, he didn't see a monster. He saw her. This haunted him for the rest of his life, and now it haunts me.